Hello, everyone. Hello, distinguished participants. We welcome you on behalf of the UNESCO Cluster Bureau in Almaty. My name is Masher Masanov. We'd like to start our new series of webinars, which are dedicated to creative and cultural industries. Various aspects of these topics have already been discussed before, while previously, specifically throughout the past year, since the beginning of the pandemics of COVID-19, specifically cultural and creative industries and various other aspects of work and life of creative people at this period of time. We basically dedicated to it the whole series of workshops. Well, if you wish to take a look at the recordings of those previous discussions, now would like to put a link to our chat box so you can take a look at those recordings of the previous discussions. Also, we also would like to move from a discussion format to a lecture-based format. And we'll be inviting today and over the past next few events, we'll be inviting experts in the area of creative and cultural industries so that they could share their rich experience and vision of the industry's development in the future. Well, we already had one lecture on this particular topic. It was dedicated to the role and convention of UNESCO 2005, basically on promoting various forms of cultural creative industries, specifically in Central Asia. The recording of this lecture is also available at our YouTube channel in Russian and English, and also putting the links in the chat box so that you could take a look if you wish to. Also, on our YouTube channel, there will be a recording of today's event, so we are recording it in order to keep up with the news, with the updates that are being published for various activities. I'd like to call upon you to keep an eye on our website and our social network pages, social media pages. So basically, those links will also be made available to you. Now, before I introduce our today's speaker, and we actually start with the webinar, I'd like to give the floor for the brief welcome remark to Ms. Chris Pickett, Director of the Almaty Cluster Bureau Office in Almaty, and the UNESCO representative in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. Ms. Pickett, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Majer. Well, kind of hope you can hear me, and the communications will enable me to be with you.
Very happy to greet you on behalf of the UNESCO Cluster Office in Almaty. So this is the first in a series of awareness-raising webinars that we have planned on cultural and creative industries for the regions of Central Asia and Southern Caucasus. Many of you may know that in 2021, this year, we mark the International Year of Creative Economy for Sustainable Development. This was proclaimed by the United Nations, and this is why we thought that it would be relevant and perhaps of interest for us to organize a series of webinars that would allow us to also promote and raise awareness about the Convention of UNESCO of 2005 on the protection and promotion of the diversity of cultural expressions. This proclamation of the Year of Creative Economy for Sustainable Development coincides, of course, with a time when we all live in the new conditions of COVID-19 pandemic, the impact of which has been particularly severe on creative economy. We know that many artists and cultural professionals have been deprived of social and economic assistance that has been provided by the governments, who struggle, of course, to tackle with the multiple problems and concerns that arise in conjunction with the lockdowns. And yet, at the same time, we also feel that perhaps more so than ever, we need and value culture. We yearn to be connected through culture. We are perhaps more actively following cultural events and activities online. And we really feel that this is essential for our well-being and for our survival. As the only UN organization with a specific mandate in culture, it is, of course, UNESCO's role to highlight and amplify culture's contribution to the global creative economy and sustainable development throughout this year of 2021. This is why UNESCO works both with policymakers and leaders, but also with practitioners in the sector. And we appeal specifically to policymakers so that they would conduct an exhaustive policy review from employment, social security, digital adaptation, intellectual property and education and other points of view. We feel that data collection and industry workers consultation can serve as a compass as we work together towards building a truly inclusive and creative economy in our countries. So this series of webinars is also organized in follow-up to our sub-regional online meeting that we already organized in January. And this was held in the framework of a project that we presently work on in Central Asia concerning film industry. And this is supported by the Republic of Korea. I would like to highlight and pay your attention to the international efforts to collect the good practices and practical knowledge in the field of cultural management in general and cultural and creative industries in particular by UNESCO. So one of the latest publications, for instance, in this field is called Culture in Crisis, Policy Guide for a Resilient Creative Sector, that provides guidance to policymakers on how to effectively address culture in COVID-19 recovery plans and how to rebuild the creative industry stronger. And this publication, I'm sure my colleagues will also share with their participants in today's webinar in the chat box. But today, so the first in the series of our webinars, we have the pleasure of having with us Ms. Gu Xin, who is a director of Master of Culture and Creative Industries at Monash University in Australia. And her professional experience has been involved in the UK, China, and Indonesia in support of small-scale local creative industry development services, but also related to creative cities and creative economy. And Gu Xin is a member of UNESCO Facility Expert Group on 2005 Convention. So I very much hope that she will bring you the insights from many countries in Asia and the Pacific, but also globally and Europe, so that you will find of interest and of relevance. And that through this series of webinars, you will understand better how this UNESCO Convention functions, what are the real practical benefits for you in the framework of the Convention. And then those countries who haven't yet ratified the Convention would also find reasons and arguments for them to join the Convention. So I would like to thank you for your attention. Wish you very rich and interesting exchanges. I should also like to thank my colleagues, Majer, Aigul, Danila, Aidana, who have been involved in the preparations of this seminar, which I hope will go smoothly. Stay well, all the best wishes. Thank you for your attention.
Благодарю вас, Криста.
Krista, thank you very much. And now I don't even need to introduce our today's speaker, Ms. Gu Xin. Well, before we actually give the floor to our today's speaker, I just would like to say this. Well, a few logistical points. Number one, all of the speakers, all of the participants can ask questions. You can use our chat box facility. Well, I will see those in the chat box. I will be able to read them and translate for our today's speaker. You can ask questions in the course of the presentation or after Ms. Gu Xin's presentation. And basically this, well, so I'm not going to take any more of your time. So I'd like to give the floor to Gu Xin, who speak about the strategy of creative economy for the resilient future. Thank you.
Right, shall I just start?
Хорошо, тогда
Okay. All right. As you can tell, I can't speak Russian, so I didn't get the hint to really kickstart my talk. But hopefully I'll be able to follow more cues as I got into this speech a bit more now. So first of all, I just want to thank you for inviting me to speak at this webinar series. I've been invited to many events around the world to share my knowledge of the creative economy. And but this event is really special for me for two reasons. Firstly, I think the audience, you are special to me. I've never been to the region. I've been to many places in Asia and Europe, but I've just never been to Central Asia. I hope that we can learn from each other's experience via this unique opportunity. And secondly, I just want to also congratulate the organizer of this event, the UNESCO's Almaty office, for the deployment of Asian experts in the expert facility. For so many years working in the culture policy area, I have witnessed a significant rise of the creative economy in the Asian region, but very few of our Asian experiences and experts have reached beyond our individual national borders. I really hope that this webinar series will be the beginning for a change of attitude from catching up with the developed West. We're always looking towards Europe and North America for ideas. Perhaps it's time that we can look inwards towards our Asian neighbors and developing stronger confidence in our local knowledge system and building stronger regional culture trades with our neighbors as well in the region. So my talk today will be composed of three parts. I will first introduce the market structure, in particular, the concept of value chain in creative economy. I present some key policy strategies aimed at maximizing the value proposition of local creative industries and how to retain and also add value from a policy perspective. And I should say that a lot of this knowledge is derived from my work in China and other East Asian countries. China is also quite relevant here, I believe, because it's changing from the state provision of culture services towards a post-socialist market-oriented development of creative economy, which I think many countries in your region will also find it very, very interesting and relevant. In the second part of my talk, I will introduce the sustainable development as a key concept for creative economy, and how countries in our region should really be thinking about ratifying the UNESCO's 2005 convention to adopt a sustainable development framework in promoting their creative economy policy. In the final part, I will present some examples from Asia and Australia, where I'm currently based, to show you some of the key approaches towards a sustainable development goals. Next, please. I should start just by simply say who I am. I'm sure you've already heard many times before this. I am in the UNESCO's 2005 Conventions Expert Facility Group. And I also co-established the Master of Culture and Creative Industries at Monash University in Australia. Here are two recent publications that I have done. So 2 books on creative industries. The first one is called Red Creatives. It's co-authored with Justin O'Connor from University of South Australia. And so this is a book very much about the China model, how Chinese creative economy is promoted through the state, huge state involvement. And then the second book next to that is called Reimagining Creative Cities in 21st Century Asia. So in this book, I developed a series of case studies in East Asia and Southern Asian cities, many of which have ratified the convention and are also part of UNESCO's Creative Cities Network, which I will talk about later. Next one, please. So I think I will start by asking this question of what is a creative economy? We hear it so often these days. It's almost ubiquitous to policymakers in our field. But I think there's a noted level of ambiguity around what the term entails, really. I think it differs from context to context. In the East Asian context that I'm most familiar with, when we speak about creative economy, we're usually referring to these 3 key ingredients. The first one is the creative entrepreneur. So we often base the imagination of creative entrepreneur on some quite long-standing images of the free creative artists, very creative, artistic, and able to act and innovate outside of the box. So they never really follow the rules. And second, we have the creative milieu, which is just a lot of really complex networks of these creative entrepreneurs being able to work together and collaborate together, and through which new ideas will emerge. And then the third one is the networks of these small and medium-sized companies operating in a zone in the city between the firm and their broader social environment, between the market and civil society. And so this is often what we refer to as the creative ecosystem. And important to note that they are not really subject to top-down state control. So I will outline here some of the different ingredients of the creative economy, how these things work together, based on this idea of the value chain. And in particular, how value proposition of firms are constantly changing as a result of new digital technologies. Next one, please. So here you will see this diagram, which outlines the 6 stages in the culture industries that values are constantly added at individual stages in the value chain. And so you will see the first one from top to the bottom. The first one on the very top is the creation of an idea by artists, designer, or musicians. These original ideas would then be developed by different groups of professionals. It could be an editor in the publishing industry or some kind of exhibition curator. And most of these ideas go on to be developed fully by production companies in the second arrow down from that, like publishers in the publishing industry or a record label company. And these companies will oversee the materialization of the original idea from the artist. And then follow on from there, you will have marketing. In many ways, the original idea could take on a completely different meaning after these original ideas being reimagined by marketers. So it could be an advertising company or production company's in-house marketing team. And marketing will also define in significant ways how products are distributed, which retail channels these products will enter. So if we're talking about television, it's broadcasters, and most recently, streaming websites like Netflix for music. It could be a performance venue. So the orange arrow, the last stage, is really important. It's the consumption. Unlike in traditional industries, I think, where consumers have almost no input in the value proposition of a product, in creative economy, individual consumers, being a blogger or fans or key opinion leaders, they can add significant value to the creative product through sharing by social media or word of mouth. So understanding this value chain is really important to policymakers, because only by understanding what types of values we're hoping to nurture and how values are generated can policy interventions be formulated. And this is particularly important for developing countries that often don't have a very mature value chain. So for example, we may have a lot of artists who are very, very creative, but in our country, maybe we're lacking marketing specialists to really promote their work to reach external audiences. Or perhaps we might not have the distribution channel to reach audiences, the right kinds of audiences. Understanding the weaknesses and strength of value chain is often the first most important task for policymakers in our region. Next one, please. So the value chain is also very important to understand where are the risks in the creative economy and how to minimize them. So at the beginning of the ideas creation, value is highly uncertain and unpredictable. There's huge amount of risks involved in come up with the idea. As the product moves along the value chain, this risk will significantly decrease as more and more people are convinced of the value of the original artistic idea. So during this process, more financial capitals and investments will be accumulated. For example, for film product, when it reaches cinema chains, it has already accumulated huge amount of capitals since the conception of the pitching, the idea pitching. So if we're thinking about the investment of time by artists into making something like a film, then the most valuable time has been invested in the first stage of the value chain. And the time value also decreases as the product travels along the value chain. So the product actually spends really small amounts of time in consumption comparing to the amount of time it took for artists to come up with this concept. Again, let's think of a film. It usually takes months or even years to make the film, but it will usually be only shown in the cinema for very small amounts of time, maybe several weeks. For policymakers, NGOs, and others, we need to really understand this unique feature of the creative economy to understand when policy interventions should be most necessary to contribute values to the creative economy and also to reduce the risks associated with our investment. For example, it's really important to support artists during the ideas creation stage, because this is where public support is most needed and most risky for individual artists. As we reach the marketing stage much further down the value chain, you will see a lot of companies involved in private companies involved in market competition. And during this stage, later stage of marketing and distribution, perhaps less policy intervention is required, as there will be less risks associated with that stage of the value chain. Next one, please. So the most powerful companies in the creative economy currently, globally, are often those companies that don't deal with production of ideas or original content at all. They are just intermediary agencies located much closer to consumer markets. They have acquired significant power in shaping consumer choices. So companies such as Netflix, Amazon, and they have emerged as the most powerful intermediaries. So what you will find is that most of these companies are absolutely not interested in developing original ideas. And as a result, those ones who came up with ideas find themselves increasingly underpaid and are often out of a job. And these are artists and designers located in the first stage of the value proposition. And governments have an obligation and good reasons for investing in developing original content, because without the first step in the value chain, without the ideas generation, the value chain cannot be realized. And the key to success, as demonstrated by many culture policy initiatives around the world, and particularly more recently in East Asia, has really come down to the fact that governments take an active role in supporting and investing in developing original content, rather than leaving artists to the mercy of the market. Next one, please. So I should say that this is where UNESCO's 2005 convention comes in. The convention has developed a model for governments and NGOs to work together to ensure that investment in creativity can be secured. So I should mention the International Fund for Culture Diversity, which is one of the key benefits for countries ratified the convention to receive support for their projects. So I believe that Tajikistan has a project supported by IFCD on their music industry. And I really do encourage governments and NGOs in our region to learn about the UNESCO 2005 Convention, especially what it does and what it tries to achieve, and various funding opportunities to be part of a larger global network to achieve sustainable development goals. And so what are some of the evidences for the value for government to support these original creativity? I will outline a few reasons here, as you can see from the bullet points on this slide. I will start by pointing out that the competitive advantage of small companies in the creative economy, because these make up the majority for any creative economy in the world. So any country, whether they are developed or developing, if they have a creative economy, it's more likely that they just have huge amount of small companies. And to support these companies are very important for governments, because they are much more likely to fill the needs for alternative goods, as these companies are more likely to take up risks associated with untested ideas, unlike the big companies. Smaller companies are also more likely to understand the authentic voice of local consumers. And most of the powerful companies like Google and Netflix these days, they can predict audience tastes. But ideas emerge out of a real human comprehension of what's needed, what's good, and what's bad is not something that big companies such as Google can predict. This and all of the above, what I've just mentioned, have now become known as the competitive advantage of the small businesses in creative economy. So suffice to say that a creative economy without a large proportion of small firms will not succeed. To maintain easy market entry for small firms should be an absolute priority for any government hoping to succeed in this industry. Next one, please. Can you go to the next one? Thank you. So this diagram here is called the long tail theory. You might have heard of this already. It's essentially about supply and demand in the wake of the digital technology. And the idea is that with these new technology, they will be able to drive a significant proportion of the demand for culture products to niche markets in the creative economy, creating a so-called long tail. And this is likely to improve the bargaining position of artists within the value chain, giving artists much more freedom in their artistic creation. Although there are still significant challenges for small firms to take full advantage of digital technology, I think it's really important for governments and other players that investing in creative economy to take into account that any creative economy strategy should really start from thinking of the development of digital capability of the local firms. Next one, please. So in the mature culture market, the role of the state are to secure a relatively higher bargaining position of local artists, as this is not just about balancing supply and demand, it's also about sustainable development, as I mentioned a few times already. But first, let me explain why artists often in this very weak bargaining position in the creative economy. Bargaining position, this term, is associated with artists' ability to minimize or manage risks in the value chain. So a famous film star or a already known product such as an Apple computer will reduce risks associated with what they're offering. As a result, they will have much better bargaining position in the value chain. So Apple can charge whatever price for their computer as they like. So a star, a film star, can also charge a much higher fee comparing to someone who's unknown to the industry because they can guarantee market success. And this market mechanism cannot self-adjust without government intervention. Without policies to safeguard local film industry, local film production, most countries in our Asia region, our local film production would be absolutely impossible in the face of Hollywood. Next one, please. And there are many ways a national culture policy can do to really achieve long-term success. I will focus on just these three strategies, and their disintermediation, re-intermediation, and finally, how to help your firms in your country to move along the value chain to really improve their value proposition. Next one, please. So disintermediation means removing some of the steps between producers and consumers, reducing the amount of time and cost involved. And this is dependent very much on new technology platforms that countries are expected to now develop. What's important to understand is that the decline of the number of record shops, bookstores, and cinemas, it has nothing to do with the quality of the work of these artists and filmmakers and designers. It is actually very much down to a lot more efficient way of distributing culture content. This has replaced the traditional physical distribution of culture products. So the first question faced by policymakers is this one. are there any disintermediation in your local creative economy, and how some of the traditional players have failed to add value to your creative economy? And how can we replace them with new forms of distribution channel via new digital technology capabilities? So I leave that question to you to think about. Next slide, please. Re-intermediation, as the term suggests, try to fill the gaps in the value chain that has caused by the removal of traditional players in the creative economy. This is necessary because of the scarcity of audience attention. These days, we have too many choices, too many products to choose from. So with this oversupply of niche products, how best for companies to target audiences for culture producers has become increasingly important. So we have platforms such as YouTube and Netflix. They emerged to fill a market gap to target specific audiences for niche products. A re-intermediation strategy from a policy perspective is to identify gaps in the value chain and to encourage your local creative entrepreneurs to take up these gaps, for example, in featuring and channeling content for targeted audience, in aggregating and packaging content online, and developing services required for online transaction. So I'll show you some of the Chinese way of tackling these from a policy perspectives next. So can you go to the next slide, please? So for example, the Chinese government has invested heavily in the so-called re-intermediation strategy that I just talked about. So they invested in huge amount of creative entrepreneurship program to establish firms in marketing, packaging, and aggregating of online music content. So I'm using music as an example here. So these music platforms combined now have over 600 million users online, while Spotify, the largest music streaming platform outside of China, only has around 140 million users. Next one, please. Amazon's Prime has allowed platform to commission original TV and film content. So they're moving backwards to start producing original culture content for the creative economy. And companies like that pose significant threats to creative economy in less mature markets. They have immense power in predicting market niches and squeezing out those players that are less powerful and less capable of generating big data about their audience in the creative economy. And many European countries have focused on how they can resist backward integration imposed by companies like Amazon that have increasingly devalued local production. And China, again, has very successfully stopped companies such as Amazon and Netflix from entering their country. But not every country can do the same without the power that China has. If not, what other ways policymakers can really apply here? And can you go to the next slide, please? So these are some things that I have learned from the Chinese policy setting in tackling this issue. Key to China's success, aside from preventing foreign companies from entering its domestic market, is the government's enforcement of intellectual property law and copyright law. This has taken away some of the pressures for individual firms in their country in creating and investing in original content. So before 2015, the Chinese culture and creative industries are losing massive amount of values domestically because of copyright infringement. They are also not very competitive globally as a result of that. But after 2015, the Chinese government has established dedicated intellectual property courts to take these culture infringements really seriously. And these courts will take notice of these infringements reported by the public around the clock. So 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, they will take action on these infringements. And there are further reforms in this space as more Chinese companies are starting to trade overseas. And the Chinese culture creative industries capability have also been developed through other backward integration strategies. For example, the government invests heavily in strategic areas such as digital media, film, and animation. They also create knowledge clusters through promoting jointly funded projects and co-production. And thirdly, most importantly, the governments have invested huge amounts of resources into education and training in the culture sector. Next one, please. And forward integration is by those other suppliers in the culture industry's value chain to enhance their bargaining position in the value chain by moving closer to the consumer markets. So artists may want to distribute their own work directly to the public rather than via an art gallery. And musicians might want to sell directly to their audience rather than through record labels. So it's really important for any policymakers these days to always think about marketing and distribution rather than just about the production of culture. Again, China has done exceptionally well in these areas. Other countries may face two challenges. The first is the lack of assets and investment that a country like China has to boost markets and distribution channels for culture goods. Secondly, they also don't have the big data of their own consumer market that the new intermediaries such as Amazon and Google have. I think the only solution for the above problems is to build regional alliances and partnerships with other countries. And this will allow countries to create alternative value chains, bypassing the control of global corporations. And this can be about building a stronger combined assets in the region. In the end, these regional networks are able to significantly enhance the value proposition of creative economy in individual countries. Next one, please. So some of these strategies have resulted in huge growth in China's creative economy as it's transitioning from an industry economy, manufacturing-based economy towards a post-industrial and post-socialist market economy. And so there's this report done by UNCTAD in 2019 that China is leading the global growth in creative economy, and its creative exports is 4 times of that of the United States. Next one, please. So, right, obviously it's really hard for us to be China or compare us with China, but big market doesn't necessarily mean success is guaranteed. I think the failure rate, as we know, for Chinese startup is really significant. I think the question for any governments hoping to nurture creative economy is this: can we promote competitiveness through creative entrepreneurship without sacrificing too much of the integrity of local culture values? The answer, I believe, lies in how well we integrate culture in sustainable development, and I'll come back to that. And this image I've shown here is a data farm in a small village in rural China. In recent years, these rural villages have become the new powerhouse the West has never seen before in driving Chinese creative economy in the new digital age. And this will lead into the second part of my talk, which is on sustainability, as I will discuss how creative economy should not be the dividing line between urban and rural, between poor and rich nations. By integrating culture in sustainable development, developing countries are more likely to achieve a better economic outcomes for themselves. So is there any questions the audience would like to ask by this stage? I'm about to move into the second part of my talk about sustainability, sustainable development. I'm wondering whether there's any questions the audience would like to throw at me.
Спасибо, госпожа Кушин.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gu Xin. Therefore, the first part of the presentation is over. And if anybody has any questions, please do write them into a chat box of Zoom. And if anybody has any comments or reaction or immediate commentaries, as a matter of fact, myself, I cannot imagine an example of an efficient disintermediation, that is to say, when we give up intermediation. I would like to say that in case of our region, the government bodies very often set up additional intermediary organizations or companies which are trying somehow to merge or to join their efforts with various creative industries rather than providing them with an opportunity for direct work with the government. If you have any other or different examples, please let us know about it. And also there was a question in the chat box on how to fill up the gap, the place for those remote intermediaries. I would say that it's probably a question related to functioning of creative industry on the regional or national level. Please, if you have any reactions, if you have any comments, please. And there was another question, how to oppose backward integration that are superimposed by big corporations such as Amazon or Google. For example, in China, Google and Amazon and Netflix are prohibited, and instead they are promoting their own local platforms. Are there any similar ways of work in our region?
Any questions? No?
Aygul Halafova, she's a specialist on culture and cluster UNESCO Bureau. Maybe you have some reactions, some immediate comments. If otherwise, then we will pass over to the second part of the presentation. Thank you very much, Majera. I don't have any reactions, but when I take a look into the chat, there is a question from Kenishbek, who is the director of the National Museum of Kyrgyzstan. He's got some questions. When we talk about the government, of course, there is local governance and there is Republican government. I'm just reading out the questions and the support of the government. What are the long-term measures, investment in education or culture? What exactly did you mean?
Kenishbek, я правильно прочитала ваши вопросы? Вы в общий чат написали?
Kenishbek, did I correctly read out your questions? Because you send your questions to the chat. Yes, yes, you're right.
Shall I continue, or is that a question?
Госпожа Гушин, если вы хотите ответить на заданный вопрос.
Ms. Gu Xin, if you would like to entertain this question, or maybe you can comment.
Sorry. Well, if you have any questions about the supply chain, of that value chain of the creative economy, feel free to ask me, perhaps by the end of the second part of my presentation. I know that some of you are doing culture management works in the region, so perhaps your understanding of how your local creative economy is working might be slightly different to what I've discovered and discussed here. So I'm looking forward to hear your view on those things as well. So perhaps I would just continue on from this point And if there's any questions that you would like to ask me, please feel free to put them through the chat box, I believe. And then the organizer will put those questions back to me. Thank you. Can we just move to the next slide, please? Thank you. And so as you can tell that this is the 2005 Convention's basic text, and I will just emphasize one of the aims of the 2005 Convention, that's sustainable development policy. That's one of 4 strategic areas that UNESCO's 2005 Convention aims to support. The implementation of the 2005 Convention has contributed to an increased recognition of the role of culture in sustainable development, notably in the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda set by the UN. And so I've just included the Article 13 of the 2005 Convention, which stated this particular strategic area on sustainable development here for your information. But feel free to check out the UNESCO website for their 2005 Convention basic text. I believe you can find them on the chat box. There are links to these basic documents for your information. Can we go to the next slide, please? I also want to bring your attention to this very comprehensive and important report commissioned by UNESCO in 2018, titled Reshaping Culture Policy, Advancing Creativity for Development. And I think what's really interesting of this report, by the way, is also free for download from UNESCO's website. And in this report, what's really important for me to register, one of the things that's stated in the report, is that development agencies too have an important obligation to integrate culture in their international programs and invest in the CCI in developing countries. I know we might have a lot of NGOs here in the audience, and I think it's really important for us to recognize the role played not just by government, but also by NGOs in this area towards a co-creation of values and policy agendas. So for NGOs, it also means that we need to ensure that culture is integrated into sustainable development policies at all levels, and that they aim to achieve economic, social, culture, and environmental outcomes, paying particular attention to possible inequalities in the distribution of cultural resources. I include an image from the report here, which you will find online as well, to show you a diverse range of programs, initiatives, agencies, and players that can contribute to the Sustainable Development Agenda via culture. Next slide, please. I'm now beginning to show you some of the examples from Asia and also from Australia, where I'm currently based. I'll start by demystifying the divide between cities and rural areas in our focus of the Creative Economy Development Agenda so far, because I think this has been the most biggest obstacle for all of us to achieve sustainable development goals. This is particularly relevant to developing countries in Asia, where rural economy actually makes up a significant component of the national economy. And there's growing inequality between the urban and the rural development. So the question I want us to think about today is, what can creative economy do for the rural economy? There is general agreement that creative economy is not restricted only to the post-industrial cities. Smaller cities and communities of varying size can all benefit from this. But to mobilize resources that are available to small cities and towns to nurture a creative economy and attracting creative class, different policy challenges present here for smaller cities and communities. Next one, please. The division between local economic development, prioritizing resource industries, whilst creative economy will just focus on the social and the culture, is not very helpful. We need to bring the two sides together. Economic, social, and culture policy agenda must be better coordinated to bring out synergies for the transformation of broader community. We can only have a balanced and sustainable creative economy if we are not treating the culture and the economy as oppositions. Next one, please. So I'm presenting to you here several key strategies, key strategic approaches for us to consider as policymakers. They are, I believe, most suitable for emergent cities, smaller communities, and rural communities. So there are 4 components, as you can tell. So there are creative entrepreneurship programs, community-led culture infrastructure development, culture participation programs, and also the development of creative cluster. So I will use some examples to show you how it's done. Next one, please. So the first one is the creative entrepreneurship model. This approach, as mentioned, is based on an identification of gaps in the value chain I talked about before. And by investing in strategic areas and by enhancing the digital capability of the creative economy in reaching their potential audiences. Ultimately, this is about treating culture as a part of the regional economy, including products and services that can enhance the value of the creative economy. So the picture I've shown you here is Creative Bandung in Indonesia, which is a city built on the links between creative entrepreneurship and community-led urban transformation programs. And there's lots of bottom-up community-centered festivals, exhibitions, and arts programs that have been activated through the Creative Bandung program to attract investment, both domestically and internationally. And Creative Bandung is also supported by municipal government using various fiscal instruments, such as tax incentives and public-private partnerships to unlock the creative energy of that city. And local demand is guaranteed in this case, comparing to the top-down planned flagship projects development. Stakeholders at all levels are involved in this process. The Bandung model is now copied all around the world, and Bandung is also UNESCO's Creative Cities Network. I knew that we have 3 cities in our region in the Creative Cities Network too. The Almaty city is a city of music, and Baku is a city of design, and Shirki is in Azerbaijan is a city of crafts and folk art. I think by joining UNESCO's Creative Cities Network, these cities are able to create inter-regional networks to really learn and share with other cities how to maximize the impact of their local creative economy. Next one, please. So the Bandung Project, as mentioned by the Bandung Project, worked with a range of NGOs, and one of the local NGOs participating in this project mentioned that the most important success of the project is the connectivity and confidence that a sharing platform brings, like a Creative Cities Network. People do not have to feel alone anymore, and this is particularly important for smaller cities where there isn't the ready access that bigger cities have to accelerate peer learning, great access to academia, and learning from international exchanges. Next one, please. So this is the second block in the strategic approach, which is called community-led infrastructure development. And these projects focused on culture infrastructures, shifts attention away from building big projects in order to attract international tourists. Instead, they focus on retaining local residents, especially young people, by preserving a unique local way of life. And this meant diverting investment from flagship buildings to lifestyle amenities, to build parks, sports facilities, cafes, and theaters for local young people. And so the image you've seen here is the Hai'an Road Regeneration Project in Taiwan. And can you go to the next slide, please? And can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so the Hainan Road Regeneration Project in Taiwan is an initiative to, instead of developing creative economy, they started by trying to find ways to bring young people back into their city, which is a declining heritage traditional old city with a very slow pace of life. And this is a joint effort of local community and government to connect heritage landscape with a creative economy agenda, inviting young people to transform the urban morphology through arts and culture means. And very unique to this project is that it didn't start from what the international tourists wanted. It started from what the local people wanted, what local community wanted. And the change of proposition resulted in a very well-defined public-private model of heritage preservation projects to revitalize the commercial core of this very small traditional city in Taiwan. Next one, please. So this is another example, but it's from Malaysia, Georgetown in Malaysia. This is another example of how community-driven initiatives are thriving on bringing people from diverse culture background to share their experiences and stories in the city. So again, it didn't start from local economic development, but it started from a humanistic approach to the development of culture infrastructures in the city and contributes to a very unique, authentic feel of the place and develop meaningful connections amongst local communities that have been living really in segregation. The attraction to Georgetown in the sense of its openness to diverse culture and its ability to attract migrants from different parts of that region who are seeking to relocate and seeking that kind of rootedness is really the essence of this project, which has been activated by the creative economy kind of narrative. There are, of course, issues of rural gentrification, with many contesting the suitability of the new culture migrants into Georgetown and the kinds of new culture infrastructures being built there. But what should be noted in essence here in this example, I believe, is that for any culture infrastructures to work, it has to address social issues of equality and access. It has to address issues of belonging, sense of belonging, and culture identity. It can't just be about local economic development. Next one, please. So this is the third strategic approach I'm going to talk about here, which is called culture participation. The basis, I believe, for any form of resilient community is participation. It is about widening access to the arts and culture, but also about support local culture production and strengthening local culture identity. There are overwhelming evidence demonstrating that culture programs which enables civic participation, will lead to long-term economic success. This is an ideal form as exemplified by community-run arts centers and co-ops. I'm sure there are many in your region as well that are built on social and ethical common grounds rather than based on the success of individual firms. The traditional links between community arts, especially around rural agriculture communities, and distant education and crafts community in Thailand is the example that I'm referring to here. It's just one of many strong traditional culture practices which should be cherished as a unique approach for other small and emerging cities to copy. I think key lesson for us to learn here from the Thai model is how to make culture available to all, not just privileged few living in the city, but it's about overcoming the vast distances between the urban and the rural communities. Next one, please. Culture participation is really important in the face of imported goods and services. The challenge is how to accentuate local voices and stories. Here is the example of Aboriginal community in Australia. I think this is highly relevant here about how this can be achieved. Across many Aboriginal arts programs in the country, active youth programs, language programs, tourist facilities and communities are brought together to deliver a multifaceted approach showcasing Aboriginal artists' work, not as a product, but as a way of nurturing civic participation and local economy. Ultimately, this is about building culture as part of history and part of lifelong public education. The resilience of any community comes from a shared understanding of the dynamics of local creative economy, not just tackling one economic problems in one place at a one particular time. What I'm trying to say is that this is an evolving programs, and we should not let the short-term nature of these projects to take away the essence of what we want to achieve through culture participation. Next one, please. The last one is clustering. The goal of any clustering building is to signify that local government's commitments to development of creative economy, to promote nodes of specialized, complementary, small-scale economic activities in a particular location. And this is what creative clusters are all set out to achieve. So instead of showing you these very well-known clusters, I'm actually going to show you this less known example of Pingyao International Film Cluster in the city called Pingyao in China. And this very small, insignificant city, you might call it, brings together a range of agendas, bring together eco-tourism, bring together heritage, and also artisanal food production, photography, and so on during the annual International Film Festival. And this has put the city on a global map of the global film industry with very significant competitive advantage over many other Chinese cities. So I think the success of Pingyao shows us that we don't have to be global cosmopolitan cities. That's not the end goal for all cities. We need to differentiate and complementing each other. And this is the way forward for smaller cities. It is about building scale of the economy by bringing together relevant culture activities and with the experiences of local and international tourists with it. Next one, please. So a related strategy of clustering is to link cluster with educational institutions supported by colleges and universities and schools as incubators, research and development centers, and hubs for culture experiments. So the image I'm showing you here is called Maker Culture for the city of Shenzhen in South China. And the creative economy, this example is trying to show that creative economy will not work as an isolated economic sector. It has to be supported by a range of social, culture, and educational programs. And this demands a clear and better guidance from local government involving a range of NGOs to extend the impacts of culture to a broad scheme of things beyond the traditional culture sector. Next one, please. So this is an image again of Shenzhen. It's the annual International Maker Fair, which is the largest trade show for the world's digital goods industry. This event not only showcases local creativity, but also advanced manufacturing in the city in China. As manufacturing is still the main GDP contributor for China, how to link these vast non-creative, not creative at all industries and the working class, large working class people working in these industries to the new creative economy is what the Shenzhen government has set out to do by utilizing creative economy as a key policy agenda. Shenzhen is now known globally as the Silicon Valley of China because of its well-defined value chain of design industries. By the way, it's the UNESCO City of Design. And I think Shenzhen has so many good things to say about how smaller countries and smaller cities can develop creative economy. Because for many of the countries in our region, heavy industries and agriculture may still be the source of good jobs for many years to come. And more often, these jobs are in rural areas, and how to provide resilience and sustainable development that incorporating these existing industries will be an important question to address for policymakers. Last one, please. Yes, to conclude, I think to date, a lot of the discussion around creative economy tend to focus on narrow economic considerations, prioritizing massive flagship projects, prioritizing international tourism. It's now time, I think, for us to really move away from these established narratives to look for new strategic approaches that are more appropriate for our region, for Central Asia. And I have mentioned just now the 4 strategic approaches that we should think about and we could think about for our region, that prioritizing local development, local voices, rural communities, and smaller cities in our region wanting to adopt the creative economy narrative. So I hope this is helpful somehow, and I really look forward to discuss in more detail with you on this. And this is all from me. I hope that's okay.
Большое
Mayor?
спасибо, госпожа Gu Xin.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gu Xin. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you very much for this lecture. I've really enjoyed your presentation and this theoretical level that you showed in your presentation. Well, just like you've been pleased to be invited by the UNESCO Bureau. Basically, we're stepping away from the Europe or US-centric approach and try to deal more with the Asian experts. So we're pleased we're having an expert like you in this region. So in the chat, we have some of the questions, and they've been translated into English. So Ms. Gu Xin, you can see those questions. In order to allow you a few moments of rest, let me try to respond to some of these questions. Mr. Keneshbek Khuchukov, basically, she responded to some of her questions already. Basically, when we talk about central government or local self-governance, I think these issues should be addressed locally, and basically both approaches are feasible. A simple example of this, we are now preparing a huge survey on the movie industry. As an example, they use two approaches there. A centralized system, a centralized model of financing of the movie industry, the French-based model, the approach, the one used in France, and also the approach of the local that is used in Germany, where financing of the movie industry is totally given to the provincial level. So the federal land governments finance the movie industry in Germany. Both approaches are quite effective. Both approaches make the movie industry some of the best in the world. But the question is, what are the long-term impact measures in terms of the government support? Ms. Gu Xin actually provided 4 strategic approaches to this that can actually be used. And again, these are the objectives for the local experts, for the local governments to tackle. So basically, they are supposed to find their own approaches. I hope I'm responding to these questions correctly. If I'm wrong, Ms. Gu Xin, please correct me. And the last one, the investments into the culture and education. What was actually meant by this? So, Ms. Gu Xin, would you like to add anything to my answer to this question?
Thank you so much. I think your response to those questions were very well formed, and I apologize for not tuning into the English channel early enough, so I missed the first bit of your correspondence, sorry. But I think the core to what you just said is this kind of conflicts between, or seemingly a conflict between the state-funded state financing model as opposed to a private individual driven grassroots culture production model. And I think film is a unique case because any film project it cannot be done just by one company alone. You know, unlike fashion or crafts, it could be done in small scale with very limited resources. Film is a massive operation, if you like, to be able to actually compete with Hollywood movie industry. So state intervention is absolutely essential for any country outside of the US trying to sustain some level of local production. Without that, none of the film production capability will be sustained at all, I think, in outside of the US. But there is this question of how much support is necessary and to what extent we need to leave some of these operations for the market to adjust its own appetite, if you like. And I think there's no perfect answer to that question, because in the Chinese model, they have pretty much there is strong investment in film clusters or investing in animation in particular, but the Chinese government has given a lot of freedom for the film markets, domestic film markets, to actually develop on its own, right? So although it seems like a huge control, top-down control or anxiety about promoting Chinese films has been displayed by the Chinese government, but if you zoom right into the domestic film industries in China, you will actually see quite a lot of freedom around what films can be produced and how they are released into the market, and also the co-production deals the government is able to support, allowing film companies to collaborate with other countries' film companies more freely. So I think there's no magic answer of how much state control is required and how much freedom we should give to the market. It's really down to, as I said, using my value chain model, I think the role of the state should be about two things critically. One is to support artists who want to develop original ideas, but are unable to sustain its creativity for various reasons. Secondly, the state also should play a huge role in developing its domestic distribution channels, for film in particular. If we are to rely on these huge intermediary companies such as Netflix to distribute our local films, we will not have a film industry in 10 years' time. Because these channels are completely disconnected, as I mentioned before, with local tastes and local aesthetic tastes and preferences. And they're also not interested actually to invest in original content in a smaller market. So yeah, to summarize, there should definitely be state intervention, but it varies from industry to industry. For film, state intervention is absolutely necessary and should be aimed at retaining local production capability. And a lot of attention should also be placed around the development of distribution channels to, in some ways, prevent Netflix and other very powerful intermediaries from conquer the domestic market entirely. Because what we need to remember is once these industries are gone, once they've been taken over, we will not be able to rebuild them. And this has been proved from many countries. You go to these, Indonesia, for instance, they have had huge problems in nurturing their domestic film industries. But this year of COVID has been really useful because Hollywood is not able to enter Indonesia or any other markets outside of the US. And Indonesia suddenly had a booming local film industries as a result of that. So we should really kind of pay attention to what's needed according to the value chain and really put our investment into areas where it's needed most. And distribution channel via digital means is really quite critical point.
Большое спасибо.
Thank you very much. The next question was asked by Dali. Will there be a recording of this lecture on YouTube? Yes, the video recording of this lecture will be available, and all of the participants will get the PowerPoints for today's speakers to the emails that have been specified at your in your registration process. The next question is from Jana Mambetova. Our speaker can see these questions in the chat because they've been translated. Hello, what changes have been introduced in the Chinese legal framework in order to support creative economies? Have the Chinese legal framework been amended in any way to support creative industries?
Yeah, so I mentioned in my talk a little bit about the intellectual property law that's introduced in China. Obviously, China joined WTO back in 2008 or around that, I can't quite remember. But since then, China has been actually a really powerful player in enforcing intellectual property laws in its domestic market. And these including, as I mentioned, the 24-hour IP courts. So courts usually run on a working days, and they usually only attend to intellectual property matters at certain time of a year. But since 2015, all these IP courts have been really active in sourcing infringement cases around the market, in particular online, because as we know that a lot of these culture products are in digital forms. So copyright infringement is really a severe issue in China's cyberspace. And so the governments actually employ experts and set up departments whose job mainly is to actually identify copyright infringements online and bring them to justice. And this is a completely change of attitude prior to 2015, when a lot of the copyright infringement is highly tolerated or ignored, and the government wasn't really serious about bring them to justice or compensate culture producers for their losses as a result of copyright infringement. But after 2015, a lot of these cases will be brought to justice by a grassroots level of, identification of cases, and also through penalties imposed on even very small cases of copyright infringement. So these days, if you're going to consume any Chinese content, Chinese culture products on its digital platforms, you'll be highly conscious of copyright infringement issues, and the companies actually being brought into in line with this policy implementation. So the companies are obliged to conform to these new regulations. And so often, if there's copyright infringement, the government will go straight to the platform companies as a first step. And so they are much more responsible now. Companies are much more responsible now to take this copyright infringement issue more seriously, because otherwise they will risk losing their license to operate in the media sphere in China. So I think that is a very, very important step towards building this really good reward system for original culture content producers. And it should be really the starting point for any country to consider.
Thank you very much. Our webinar's time is running to a close. Maybe the last question, Bahtagul Mektinova is asking this. Would you mind telling us which social media can we use to keep up with the creative industries in China?
Mm-hmm.
Which social media pages can we use to follow the creative industries in China?
Yeah, obviously. Yeah, that's a great question. So, you might have all heard of this company called TikTok, which is really the been mentioned so many times in media in the last year due to its issues with in the US. The Donald Trump, the ex-president of the United States, was hoping to close it down, saying that it's a spy agency for China. But TikTok is now a global company, and it has short videos which mostly young people will share of their creative expressions and styles. But other things like a Bilibili is very important for music and films. And obviously, we all heard the king of app, WeChat, which you have to use somehow. The license into China now is not the passport, but WeChat. And it's a great way of maintaining communication with culture producers within China. And there are just so many of them. There are listening apps and radio apps, also popping out on a monthly basis. And there's fashion app, the Little Red Book, apparently has been really popular. So there's just a huge amount. But the thing is that because they are separate from Facebook and YouTube and Netflix, therefore people outside of China never heard of them. But within China, there's a huge ecosystem for social media to actively distributing and consume content via those channels. Yeah, so I encourage the audience, if you're interested in Chinese culture products, do check out Bilibili, TikTok, and WeChat, all of these other social media websites. which I just escaped me in the last second. But I'm happy to maintain connection with the audience today. If you want to find out a bit more about Chinese creative industries, feel free to be in touch. And yeah, I'm happy to share information.
Спасибо. Я
Thank you.
напомню,
Thank you. I just would like to remind Ms. Gu Xin that if she recalls any other social media platforms, then she could probably share those with us in chat. There is one more question, maybe the last question. Well, could you give us the name of a specific governmental programs in China and ways to implement those? What are the government and how do they estimate the efficiency of these programs, government support programs for the cultural development?
So you might have heard of the 5-year plan, the national 5-year plan. I think that's the most significant symbol of a post-socialist society like China. So in Australia, we never plan anything. So things just emerge naturally. But in China, governments can looking 10 years ahead or 15 years ahead. So Chinese government at the national level, they have a 5-year plan. I'm not entirely sure what's the current one, but in the last 5-year plan, they usually set out the creative economy as a strategic development area. So there'll be a range of policies developed around the national agenda. So that's the national policy framework that will be then translated and interpreted by provincial government and local government. And often, I think, this is when funny things started to emerge, because every city and provincial government may have completely different interpretation of what the policy actually means. I'm sure many of the countries in your region face similar problems, because often these national policy agenda are very abstract and they are not very specific in how they should achieve. And especially in the culture area, because it used to be affiliated with the Ministry of Culture, but when it translated into the provincial or city government, it's much more aligned in some ways with the Department of Communication or the Department of Economic Development or Business Development. And with the different association at the department level, which means it's highly likely that the agenda will be reset. So in the city of Shanghai or other Eastern Coast cities, which has a stronger economic agenda, they tend to pursue creative economy as something like a local economic development agenda. So in Shanghai, where I'm most familiar with, they have used creative economy purely as creative cluster development agenda. So real estate, creative real estate development, really. But if you're going to look at the Western parts of China, the interpretation is entirely different. So it could actually be about addressing social issues, poverty, about rural life quality enhancement. So in Shenzhen, for example, it's about manufacturing, how to link that back in. So it depends on where you are. So your policy may look completely different. But as we always say, the art is all in the interpretation, right? So in Chinese, we say there's a policy above and there's action on the ground. And this is when also international exchange take place. So a lot of international experts got brought in by different cities to tell them different ways of develop their local policies. So yeah, I think this is how the Chinese policy has been about in the last 10 years. But I think the recent emphasis has been very much on digital, because China is big on blockchain and the bitcoins. and also the cashless society, push towards a cashless society, all of that infrastructure is being developed to actually support a future of creative economy that's very much going to be driven by digital technology and its distribution networks, which I talked about in the first part. I hope it's helpful.
Thank you very much for this. We'll probably be winding up this webinar. So Ms. Gu Xin, thank you very much again. I would like to remind our listeners that this is not our last webinar on cultural and creative industries. I'm just now putting in the chat the schedule for the upcoming events, and would like to remind you that the recording of this webinar will be available on YouTube. And now, in conclusion, we'll ask Ms. Algul Khalafova, the culture experts from the UNESCO Cluster Bureau in Almaty, to conclude this event. Majer, thank you very much. Dear colleagues, I'm very pleased that you've joined us today and supported us together with our moderator and our distinguished speaker from Australia. And as Majer said, today, this is our first meeting, but we'll definitely continue with this trend, and we'll continue inviting our facilitators, our experts from UNESCO Facility Group on 2005 Convention. And Ms. Gu Xin, thank you very much for your efforts today. It's been very interesting. It's been very useful. I think amongst the participants, we have one of our next speakers. And our next event is going to be happening on March 19, on Friday, and on March 26. So please register, join us again. There will be different topics to be covered for cultural and creative industries. And like Ms. Gu Xin said, well, over the using these events, we'll not be able to provide you with all of the answers. We'll not be able to highlight all of the key studies or best practice examples globally. But at least we can start this particular process. We can start thinking about some of the new ideas. We can get inspired with these new ideas. I think this is what we are working for and what we're doing our webinars for. So thank you very much, everyone. And we'll be looking forward to see you on Friday again, March 19th, Friday. Thank you very much and goodbye.